Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon from wherever you're dialing in today. I'm dialing in from Australia, and it's the morning. Drop in the chat. Let us know where you're dialing in from. Okay, everything's filling out pretty quickly. We'll just be getting started in about a minute, everyone. So hold tight. Our wonderful panelists are already here. Welcome. Welcome, Lydia from Portland. Montreal. Boston, San Francisco, Vancouver, Melbourne, Australia. G'day. See another Antipodean on the call this early. Brazil, Oakland, California. All right, well, it is 8 a.m. So let's get started, everybody. Welcome to the Inside Out webinar. This is Dovetail's webinar series where we get a bunch of product experts to get together to inspire, challenge, and learn together. Today, I'm joined by my amazing colleague, Colin, who's going to be here operating the chat. Be sure to drop all your questions in there, keep the conversation alive. We have got a Q&A section, which you should be able to find in the UI down there in Zoom. If you can, drop your questions in there, but we also have the chat going, so we will pick questions out from there as well. And of course, we are joined by our two wonderful guests and panelists. We have Jeanette Fuccella, currently of ServiceNow, formerly of Pendo. Jeanette first came onto my radar through an article that I read called Building a Framework for Prioritizing User Research. Fantastic article about the different kinds of research that you can apply to products development, depending on how I'm probably going to butcher this, Jeanette, but how certain or how clear you are about the problem space. I'm also joined by Jens Schumacher, founder of Released. Released is AI notes powered by Jira, and Jens is a former Atlassian Head of Product for Jira Service Desk. So big Jira fan, Jens.
It's good to hear.
Yeah, you've spent probably the majority of your working life on Jira at this point.
I did. Well, across Atlassian, I would say. I started on Confluence when I was 24, and then I left when I was 40. So it's like, 15 years at Atlassian was a long time.
It is a long, long time. So the cool thing about both of our guests today is not only are they both two product experts, leaders in their field with tons of experience on their belts, but also people who both built and spent time getting to know and understand researchers and product managers in a product sense, which I think is really fascinating. Both Pendo is obviously very focused on product management, and Jira is also something, that would be one of your major users. So we are expecting some great conversation today. I should have perhaps introduced you both in the boxing parlance, like a color commentator, the red corner and the blue corner, because today we are going to be talking a little bit about that tension that exists between product management and research. It's obviously mostly a very fruitful relationship, but sometimes a little bit fraught. Just a little bit of housekeeping at the top before we get started. Thank you to everyone who did vote in our poll. We are going to ask all those questions today, but we also want to make the session as lively as possible. So keep the discussion going in chat, post your questions, just throw them in chat, throw them in Q&A, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. So today's topic, as I mentioned before, we're talking about the intersection of product management and research. So a very important partnership. There's a lot to collaborate over, but of course there is that little bit of tension. It's mostly a fruitful relationship. After that, we'll look into AI, because of course, and by the end, we're going to look at a hotspot for PM and research collaboration and drill down onto building an insight-driven roadmap. So without further ado, So as I was saying, I'm going to jump straight into the first question. It is about PMs and researchers and collaboration. So in a survey conducted a few years ago now by NMG, it was revealed that product managers and UX professionals have markedly different views of their job responsibilities. And some of the biggest misunderstandings surround research. So namely, who should do discoveries, ideate on new designs, and determine task flows in the UI. So why do you think there is such a misalignment between product managers and UX professionals over roles and responsibilities? Jeanette, why don't we start off with you?
Sure. Why do I think there's such, you know, at its core, I think it's, whoa, we gotta move on. Okay, I think we're good.
Oh, good. Yeah, we're good.
Good. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you know, some of this is just about defining roles and responsibilities. It comes down to, you know, that basic task. If I recall correctly from that article, the clash gets more severe as the more senior folks become. And one of the things that we've talked about is that in our prep was that is the more senior you become, the more proficient you are at other tasks. So in the same way that I might consider myself not just a researcher, but a product strategist, Jens probably considers research to be part of his portfolio of expertise. That doesn't mean that he is a researcher or that I am a product manager. It means that we can do some of those tasks. And so setting those boundaries and those expectations right off the bat with your colleagues is really helpful, just to have that conversation about where you feel like you have strengths and weaknesses and what how you can complement one another. So not so much of a boxing match as maybe a therapy session.
I couldn't agree more. Jens, what's your take on this? Do you, in your experience, both at Atlassian and currently, like, have you seen any of this misalignment and tension, I suppose, between product managers? I should add that, like, the author of an NNG article that followed that survey mentioned that there seems to be a tendency for both UX professionals and product managers to think that everything is their job. Is this something that you've experienced, and why do you think there is? Why do you think that that exists?
I think not just those two roles, but in general, the industry has changed quite a bit on how you approach software development. So if you go back like 20 years, a lot of those roles or functions were pretty siloed. So if you think of Q&A and engineering and design, it was usually design, create something, throw that over the wall to engineering, then they throw it over the wall to QA. So everybody had pretty clearly defined roles, and you didn't even like look at the other function at all. And that obviously had problems. And the more we kind of started coming together, the more overlap there was. And like PM wasn't really a thing 20 years ago, it just like started to become more popular. And I think like research as well in tech organizations only came, I don't know, Jeanette, like the history, I can tell you from Atlassian, like I don't think we had researchers until the company had like 250 or 500 people. It just wasn't a thing early on. And so I think there's the silos is one thing, and then working closer together and having that overlap. The other part is as organizations grow, you add specialization to the mix. Before, when you start off in product management, you basically do all the things. When you have a 15 people company, maybe you don't have a researcher. That really depends. But as you grow, then you have to give up some of those responsibilities or bring people in. And I think this is where the tension comes in.
Yeah, and talking on that tension, you know, in the community, like online and LinkedIn and Slack and different communities across the web, I've run into talk about democratization. Obviously, it's a huge topic with researchers. It's a huge topic in the industry at the moment. And there seems to be quite a lot, there's a wide variety of opinions, but like on the more extreme side, researchers are arguing that, you know, nobody should really touch research. PMs shouldn't really touch research. It is a specialized craft, which is true, and requires a specialized set of skills, and in order to do it correctly. Then obviously on the other side, there's a lot of researchers who are very encouraging of other roles participating in research in different kinds of capacities, and there's a kind of a range of opinions in between all of those two polar opposites. Jeanette, what's your opinion here? Should research be conducted by researchers only, or should product managers do it too? By the way, this was the number 5 most voted question by our audience.
Yeah, the classic researcher response is it depends, right? And honestly, I don't even know that it's when I'm just not one for creating harsh lines like that. It's when we think about democratization, it's about the organization, each individual in the organization having exposure to data from customers and beyond, and lots of folks in the organization. I mean, I think that was one of these first revolutions of UX research, was this awareness that, hey, we're not the only ones who talk to customers and have data that we can share. And that really, I mean, I don't want to speak out of turn for the whole discipline, but I do think that it did take our discipline for a bit of a curve. Like, we had to really acknowledge that we aren't the keepers of the data, and that we are actually better for being able to leverage other disciplines who also have data to share, particularly if we can then help triangulate it. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon, right, that folks begin to feel proprietary about what they do in their work, and then there tends to be concerns around who's doing what. The one thing I will say is I do distinguish between user research and talking to customers. I do think that there is a line there. Both are important, both are valuable. We're going to circle back to this at the end, I believe. Both are important, both are valuable, but they are not the same thing. Talking to customers is what PMs do all the time, should be doing, good PMs do all the time. And they're gaining information and forming hypotheses along the way. But those calls are generally not set up to be a research call. Just the course of that conversation is not a research call, and they tend to be essentially a sequence of samples of one, right? Whereas research is set up to have rigor, to have a hypothesis, to have a set of research objectives, and to then execute against a number of different, whether sample size, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, but you're going to have a number of participants who are engaging in the same kinds of questions and dialogues to test a hypothesis or to achieve an outcome. And there's a difference there. Now, they can play off each other. Jens might be talking to a customer and say, hey, I heard this thing. I don't know how broadly that manifests itself among our community. We might spawn a research project off of that, right? So if we're working together, it can be a really fruitful relationship.
Jens, so talking to customers, is it the same as research? Or actually, like, what if it's not the same as research? What is the sort of objective of this sort of talking to customers? Jens?
Well, I think the distinction is pretty interesting and valuable, because that comes back to the roles and responsibilities. So as a product manager, you have to speak to your customers, otherwise you're not doing your job. Like, otherwise you can't build empathy, otherwise you don't understand the problems, and just hearing things secondhand is just not the same. And I think in many organizations that's misunderstood. Like, you basically have research coming in, and this is what basically a bit happened at Atlassian as well, where product managers then thought, okay, well, I'm not talking to customers anymore, I just wait for that information to get delivered. And that's obviously not the way to do it. So yeah, I think there's a good distinction between the rigor. And in terms of democratization, again, it comes back to there's more role overlap, and more like product managers take on, like, obviously the talking to customers, but then researchers can help them do it better, right? So making sure you ask the right question, making sure there is some patterns in there, and even that might not even qualify as research just yet, but at least you get more output or more value out of the interviews that you do. And not like, honestly, most product managers come from very different backgrounds. Like, my background is engineering, some people come from finance, so very few, like support. And then you have some researchers as well, and those people are obviously pretty proficient at performing those interviews, but most of them are not. And this is where the value comes in, working closely with the researchers and better understanding what are the best questions to ask there. And you see that in other functions as well, when over the last 15, 20 years. QA is another example there, where usually you give them things and they test it, they have the scripts and they run it. And that has evolved in coming from like quality assurance to quality assistance, where the QA people help the engineering team to think about edge cases as they develop, to prevent things from breaking in the first place rather than finding it at the end. And I think something similar is the same in research. You kind of establish and create best practices to begin with to get a better outcome.
Excellent. I'm just having a quick look at the chat here. There's a couple of people in the chat talking about their own democratization programs. Interested to hear from you all if you have engaged in some degree of democratization, or what kind of situation you guys have at your own workplace. Do PMs do research? If so, how much? Do researchers help them? Jeanette, I saw you nodding along a lot there to the sort of participation that researchers or how researchers can help product managers. Can I just get you to touch on that lightly, perhaps, Jeanette? Like, what if we're in a situation where PMs are talking to customers every week, and perhaps researchers are conducting more rigorous in-depth research on the side to, obviously they serve different purposes. How should a researcher sort of look at a PM and their sort of, let's call it continuous discovery method of approaching this? Like, what should researchers feel about this, especially speaking out to those researchers who might be reticent or don't really necessarily agree? What would you say to them, and how might they be able to help a PM actually do that job better?
Yeah, I mean, and let's be clear, we're going to help each other do our jobs better, right? I'm going to be a better researcher because my product manager helps me to see what the problems are that they're facing, how it connects to the business and to the monetization strategy. So it goes both ways. But as researchers, and not to like, plug that framework, but that's where it came from, right? And if you haven't seen it, it's a 2x2, and it's just basically problem clarity on one axis, and the other axis is the risk, specifically the risk of getting it wrong. And so there's this 2x2, and a lot of that came out of my own sort of experience of having a bazillion different research questions and having to triage them and figure out, where am I going to spend my time, and what can I delegate to someone who's not a researcher but is qualified to do research, right? So we can together talk about, okay, where do we need the most rigor? We're an industry, we're not in academia, so we don't have to be 100%. In fact, we're never 100% sure or confident of what we're doing. We get to 80%, if we're really, really lucky. And so, the places where we need the most rigor, that's where we want our researchers. That's where we want to use those skills. In places where it's, it's not maybe as scary a bet, maybe it's not as risky, then we can help to equip our product manager counterparts with helping them shape the discussion guide. We can help to train them on just ways of asking questions, and particularly more junior product managers. It's an uncomfortable thing to do, and it's not natural the way that we host interviews. And so there's definitely education and learning that goes along with that we can help to provide. Likewise, we need our product managers to help us have the subject matter expertise necessary to conduct the interviews and to analyze the data, right? That's the other piece that we tend to not think about, is what happens after you collect the data. A lot of bias comes in after the data has been collected, before, but also after.
I think we're going to touch a bit on this when we get to the roadmap section of the talk, where we can talk about how to prioritize insights, or how to look, or perhaps how to ensure that bias isn't coming into the insights that you're creating there. Just want to talk a little bit about the current economic situation. Obviously, everybody in the chat is aware that over the past year, particularly the tech industry, has been negatively affected by economic downturn across the world, and that has resulted in layoffs. And unfortunately, from anecdotal sort of, official numbers are hard to come by, but at least anecdotally, I've seen a lot of people from both product management and research being negatively affected by layoffs in the tech industry. So I just wanted to ask why we might think this is occurring, and what would be the impact of this on customer satisfaction or on delivery of great products? Jeanette, let's start with you. Why do you think both PMs and researchers are being negatively impacted by layoffs?
Sounds pragmatic, right? If a company is not making their numbers, they have to cut people. At the end of the day, the business is there to make money. And as an old person, I've seen this trend, before. So some of that is just what it is. If you're a recruiter, like if we think it's been tough for us, look at your recruiter friends, the folks who are recruiters in the industry. They're the very first people to get cut. If you're not hiring, you sure don't need recruiters. So everybody's job is to some degree, at the mercy of the macroeconomic climate and the specific, revenue trends of their organization. But it has, to be sure, it has woken a lot of us up. It's made a lot of us think about our role, our value to the organization, to be a lot more intentional about connecting what we're doing to the business objectives, to the monetization strategy, to be able to draw a more direct line. And then, I think there's pros and cons to that. But I'm going to pass it to Jens because I've been talking a lot.
Okay, Jeanette, I've just got something in the chat here. Rachel Lindsay says she's just moved over at her company from being a technical recruiter to an associate product manager. Great move, fantastic move. I'm sure. Jens, why do you think that, say, product has been negatively impacted? And I think I'm going to double down a little bit harder, and I'm going to ask, like, if Jeanette mentioned that the reason is it's like recruiters and other roles will also be impacted, but like why is it that product management or perhaps research isn't seen as mission critical or isn't seen as sort of vital to the top line growth of the company? And perhaps if we can go into it, how can we change that instinct of the company perhaps to sort of see it differently, or is there some work that can be done here? Jens.
Yeah, I think first of all, we're probably in a bit of a bubble. So there's like a little echo if we hear that product managers get laid off or researchers get laid off, like probably like 10x in our mind. So I'm not sure if it's as dire as it's sometimes presented. I think I actually wrote like a blog post about the death of the product manager is vastly exaggerated. But to Jeanette's point, I think if a company doesn't make money, they basically focus on what makes them money in the short term. And then looking at the roles, like program management is another role that was heavily impacted in some organizations that I talked to. They kind of reorganize their projects, and depending on who's on that project, those roles get affected. So I'm not sure if it's one particular role, but PM and research both have in common that they're more long-term focused. So if your goal as a company is for short-term revenue, you probably look at those roles. It's like, okay, like how much research do we need? Do we know what we need to do in the next year? Maybe we can save some money by letting some roles go that are not immediately necessary or required. So I think that's part of it. And then the impact of this, of course, is that as they do this, eventually like 6 months, 12 months in, they have to pick up those roles again, because the quality in the long term or that kind of strategic vision will be impacted, and you have to start from scratch. So that's always the same with like recruitment as well. Like then like now all of a sudden you have to start hiring again. It's like, okay, now you have to rebuild the function, and it just takes a while. And it's just for a company, it's like a really tough balance to find. And usually what tends to happen is that you go overboard in like one direction or the other. It's always like that extreme, and you have to find that pendulum in the middle.
Very, very sensible answer. I'm thinking about how, I mean, it makes sense that these roles that effectively support the development of products, make it more efficient and effective in the long term, are potentially going to get sort of impacted first because of, I mean, it does sound like a little bit of short-term thinking is taking place there, but perhaps that is the kind of thinking that we have to get used to during rougher economic times. I've just got a question here.
just a quick follow-up as well. I think there's a couple like high profile examples. I think like Dovetail is one of them where product managers like kind of were not the highest priority. Airbnb was another one. And I read an article on the Airbnb one, which was interesting, where I think originally was argued that we're taking the same model like Apple, where there are no PMs, and then like a few Apple PMs responded and say, hey, like I'm here. So I think it's always painted as pretty extreme when it's not really. And the whole thing of, they got rid of Airbnb, got rid of all the PMs is also not quite true. I think they changed the focus from being just focused on product to focused on the go-to-market, and they changed the title to like a product marketing manager to emphasize that focus. And for a company like Airbnb that's very much consumer focused, that marketing and go-to-market focus and being really close to the consumers obviously super important. So I think that, again, it's like exaggerated, and it's just like a couple of functions combined and a forcing function to get the product managers think more end to end. And that's the traditional where product managers come from. If you think of kind of like Procter & Gamble, like product managers, they were brand managers there and responsible for the entire end to end, including the go to market. And I think that's where some tech companies like go towards now as well. Although, like as you scale as a tech company, you can't have every product manager be responsible for the whole end to end. That's like another discussion for another time.
Yes, absolutely. I've just got a question here from Tim Dixon, a researcher at Atlassian. Shout out to Atlassian, one of our favorite customers. Tim is keen to know what Jeanette's pros and cons are that she just briefly mentioned. Do you know where to pick up on that one, Jeanette?
Yeah. I also want to just really quickly first to name the elephant in the room, which is a lot of the companies that did a lot of layoffs grew faster than they should have, right? And that's not because somebody's an idiot. It's because of other macroeconomic pressures, right? To, we all know the headlines on that, but that like those companies, a lot of them hired more people than they should have. And they were, of course, correcting and adjusting when the inevitable market correction happened. And so that's just, that's a thing to know when you're looking, I would say to anybody, when you're looking at companies to work for, that's, it's going to be a risk. The smaller the company, the more growth oriented the company, it's going to be a risk versus, there's different risks with, and poor Tim, I keep saying, well, there's pros and cons. Okay, so the pros and cons. So look here, I'm just going to name it. And so you're going to pardon my French when I say this, but, as a researcher, I could claim all kinds of stats around like, oh, I boosted revenue, or I boosted NPS, or I boosted this, or I boosted that. And anybody worth their salt is going to call me on my bullshit, right? Because the research that I do hopefully does inform the decisions that the company makes to achieve its business goals. But drawing that straight line, I mean, that's part of the challenge is it's not a straight line. And I mean, if you can do it, more power to you. Maybe in B2C, I've always been in B2B. But and I know people do it, right? But I think I'm probably more honest and humble than I should be sometimes, and saying like, I don't know that I could take credit for that. I contributed to it, but I don't know that I could draw that straight of a line.
We've published an article in Outlier a while back by Corey Wyden from Lightrix, and she was making the case that during a recession, actually, you can't afford not to have research because, research is all about de-risking product bets, and now more than ever, you really can't afford to be building things that people don't like or care about. And research is the fast track to finding out what people like and care about, and gives you that superpower to be able to actually deliver it to them. So, obviously, I'm biased. So I work for Dovetail, but we obviously think that research is a lot more important to the business line than perhaps sometimes it's given credit for. We've got Rachel Lindsay here saying that it's just on this sort of hyper growth train and how things have sort of panned out after the market correction. That a year and a half ago, They started with 250 people, hired up to 450, and now back down to 250. So that's like, that is a roller coaster. Shout out to anyone else who's experienced something like that. Must feel very stressful, I imagine, actually working in those kinds of environments. But you know, this is the world we live in. I want to jump in.
I think the
Yep, go ahead,
the hard part is as well, like I read an article the other day that argued, or kind of drew the line for research to like, oh, we made $500,000 for the business. And it was interesting. It's basically you save yourself from making a wrong decision or a wrong bet. And then that obviously saves you a ton of time in terms of engineering, in terms of support, in terms of like redoing this whole work. So it's like for sure. But I think the hard part is there's no A/B test. What would have happened if we went down the other path, right? So, and this is where it's hard to put the numbers in, but it's clear that like if there's one path better, and you manage to pick that path because you've done the research beforehand, that there is clear value to an organization. It's just always hard to articulate it.
Yes,
sorry, John, but just especially if it's foundational, right? Like we didn't go off and do a study. It's because we had done all this research in the past that Jens was able to make this good decision. And like that happens so often of the value of my work isn't in what we do, it's what we don't do.
That's right, exactly.
And how do you measure that? Like early in my career, there was a designer and I that worked together, and like every project we worked on got canned and it became a joke. But we, you know, it just, every time we would get to a certain point in the process of proving out this new concept, like it just didn't. And so, you know, we're saving the company a ton of money, but yeah.
Just touching on that foundational research bit just really fast. You know, this kind of research that really like, you know, sets the direction strategically for a company. Have you ever found that like the kind of knowledge that comes out of those studies, does it become sort of incorporated so like widely within the like in sort of the company's shared brain that like it almost is taken for granted that like, you know, we're going in this direction? But like, do you ever run into this kind of situation? Or Jeanette, Jens, go.
I'm trying to think of a concrete example. Like certainly if you do this foundational research, and it is important, like the most important thing is that leadership is bought into it and drives that message across the organization. Like you have to make sure that gets really populated. Otherwise it just doesn't really work. I'm trying to think of a concrete example where foundational research was so critical. It was like, well, 15 years Atlassian, the products like Jira and Confluence already existed when I joined. So there was what was foundational? I'm sure there was something like foundational research in terms of like enterprise, but it's usually about kind of like more feature driven. I can't really recall anything that's super foundational. Depends on how you define foundational, I guess.
Well, yeah. I was making the quick point before that like the foundational research, it gets sort of absorbed so sort of widely by the company. It can be hard to pinpoint and be like, oh, that's right, we're doing this because of that research. Is this something that you can
right. Well, that's like every researcher's dream, right? Is that you become imbued into the tapestry, the fabric of the organization, which again, I'm always the pro-con person. That's lovely and that's great. And we want everybody thinking alike about this particular persona or archetype, whatever you want to refer to, or job to be done. But then it becomes difficult to challenge that. So there's kind of a good, a pro to the energy and the momentum of that. But you do have to also then make sure that you're course correcting and checking yourself to, does this still make sense? If it's foundational, it should last over time, but that doesn't mean we got it exactly right when we did it. I will tell you an example, and it was actually shared to me by a former VP of UX, that when Gen AI came out, now I'm just telling you what he told me. So I wasn't there when this happened, but that when Gen AI came out, and of course, everybody was frantically trying to incorporate Gen AI into their products. His statement to me was that because we had done so much foundational research, particularly on jobs to be done prior to that happening, they were able to launch a new product based on, integrating Gen AI in 7 weeks.
Yeah. See, that's amazing.
amazing.
Yeah, and that's a sort of like unquantifiable, just to touch back on sort of what Jens and both of you have been saying. It's just like it's hard to say, well, we really need research because sometime in the future there might be this amazing technology that's just kind of innovates out of nowhere, and we need to harness its potential quickly. So having that background of research, it's almost like it's a very like a lot of foresight. It's a very long-term sort of play, or sort of people with a long-term thinking. Touching on AI, we love to talk about AI. It's the only thing that I think everybody is talking about this year. So let's talk about PMs, researchers, AI. How has AI changed organizational needs? And how does this impact the research? How does it impact research and product management roles? Jens, let's start with you.
Yes, in particular in product management, in the last 10 years, it became a lot more data driven. So as a product manager, you have to take all those different data points and put them together. And as humans, we're pretty bad at taking data points and working with that. So it just takes a lot of time of analyzing it. So I think this is where AI is really useful, being able to make sense out of large data sets if you have the luxury to get those data sets as a company. And any of those repetitive tasks that you have to perform there, whether it's like analyzing and like grouping and making sense of that data, that can free you up then to talk more to customers or do other jobs there. And yeah, I think like AI in terms of, I think there's like some danger that it gets too biased. Depends on how you use AI, right? And I think that's something that we have to be aware of, in particular when you use generative AI to say, like I heard product managers starting to write customer stories, for example, right? So they obviously write those customer stories based on information that is already on the internet. So it's inherently biased. So you probably can't expect to come up with creative new solutions there because it's all based on things that are around largely. But it's really good as a brainstorming tool as well to generate ideas and just get your mind kicking. So that's what I've been using it for as well. It's like, hey, like give me like I have this problem, like what are like 5 potential solutions? It's like, oh, okay, well, this is good. And then you can expand on that. And I find this super, super helpful. So it's really, I don't think it replaces any function at this stage, like whether it's like research or product management, but it really can enhance and take a lot of the grunt work. The same with like writing user stories. Not everybody uses stories or specs or anything like that. Not everybody's a great writer. Like in the startup, you have to do a lot of writing that's not even that's quite different as well. So when I have to write security, fill out security questionnaires, for example, you don't want to write that in the language that you usually write. It has to be a little bit more sophisticated. Or R&D text return documentation. So for that, to just use generative AI to generate some of that content, you still give it input, but then you work together with the AI to create that output. And I just find that invaluable. I think it's super powerful.
Yeah, fair enough. Jeanette, I mean, you've recently written an article for us about this. I think it's almost not worth asking now, like, is AI going to take everyone's jobs? Because I feel like we're all pretty aware of the limitations. Out of the gate, everyone was kind of blowing it up a little bit. It was very scary for some people at times, but settled a bit now, a bit more mellow. Jeanette, how do you see sort of research, particularly, how will AI impact that role? Like, and how can researchers better harness the power of AI? And I know there's a lot of complications there as well. So perhaps if you could run us through your thoughts on this.
Yeah, there's sort of what it is and what we can imagine, right? And the imagine part is, I mean, really exciting. Just like Jens said, like take away the drudgery of my job. That's awesome. If I never had to code another video again, that would be great. But I still want to be able to analyze and synthesize, right? So there's going to be a fine balance, and you guys are going to you have your work cut out for you at Dovetail, because there's always that trust control dilemma of taking too much away and we don't trust it, and but the today situation, of course, we've all learned some the hard way, you really shouldn't be putting confidential information into ChatGPT. And so there's limitations, right? So unless you have, an enterprise license, or, I'm sure, like, and this is not a security expert. So Jens, talk to him. You're over here. That's why I keep pointing that way. But right, like, I know enough to know not to put confidential information in my public ChatGPT UI. But what I did do, and this is like, if you read the article on it, like, so you might have already figured this out, I am a verbal processor. I think by talking and communicating, and most of the time I'm talking to myself, which is really unfortunate. I used to have an office mate who would leave at the end of the day, and I'd be in the office, and he'd say, okay, Jeanette, I'm leaving now. So, people are going to know you're talking to yourself. But now I'm ChatGPT to talk to. And this is great. So I'm still talking to myself, kind of, but that's what I have, like, the today moment have found very similar to what Jens was saying. And there's even been research, I think it was NNG, that did the research on it actually boosts creativity. They're finding that it is boosting creativity in people because it's going to offer avenues to pursue, even in a non-confidential context, avenues to pursue that you might not have thought of. And so whether you can pursue those, those might be additional research questions you hadn't considered, or other data points you hadn't considered, but it does allow you to diverge. It also allows you to refine what you're thinking through the conversation that you're having with a conversational agent, right? So it's going to spit back things to me. And even sometimes, even in those, maybe not the terrible hallucinations, but even when it doesn't get it quite right, like, that helps me to refine, what I'm thinking about, what are the parameters of what I mean and what I don't mean. And the example in the article is about, defining what is an insight. So what is an insight, right? Like, we probably all have different definitions. ChatGPT had a definition, and it just asking it helped me to refine my own definition of that. And how do we then create a good insight based on that framework? And so, yeah, that's kind of the today, but I'm very excited about what tomorrow looks like.
What tomorrow looks like. Yeah, well, let's touch on that a little bit. So what does tomorrow look like, Jens?
Just before I just came up with thoughts. One thing I read yesterday is that brainstorming generally tends to lead to worse outcomes than coming up with ideas by yourself. And then the best is if you individually go and think about things, and you come together and you discuss them, and then so that apparently yields the best results. I was thinking brainstorming with an AI is quite different from that perspective. You still get input from others and sparks ideas, but I think because it's not this group dynamic and a group think, you question it, it just amplifies like your own thinking there. So it's kind of like the best out of both worlds. You brainstorm with like other input and other opinions, not just by yourself having to come up with everything from scratch, but you don't inherently get biased because you distrust the AI. Hopefully you don't like trust everything.
Well,
just take it at face value.
AI's facts are often wrong. We've got John Hardy saying, beware of generative AI hallucinating facts. It's fundamentally probability driven, not necessarily fact driven, which is very true. But it is good at interrogating your thinking in that it can evaluate what you have for inconsistencies, hypocrisies. As Jeanette mentioned in her article, it's kind of like a therapist in that sense. You can kind of get it to probe and break down your thinking, and out of that perhaps it yields some insight. So into the future, looking the next 5 years, how do you see AI kind of the inevitability of AI rising and becoming part of the everyday function of product management, but also the kind of tools and products that we'll be building because of AI? Jens, obviously you founded a company based on this, so keen to hear your thoughts.
So even though I worked at a search company where we did had like an AI search before, but still, if like even a lot of AI workers this time last year, if they predicted what would the next year look like, everybody would have been completely wrong. So I'm a little hesitant to predict it, but my guess is that we've seen the biggest jump for a while now. I think that was just something that nobody expected. And from here on, I feel like there will be more incremental improvements. I don't like, obviously hopefully the facts get better over time. The math gets better over time. That would be great. Just basic math would be good, so I don't have to pull out my calculator. Integrating with different sources, I think is going to be the biggest jump in organization, or also generally. If you have a ton of data in your organization and you can access this and you can leverage this, and that's just going to be a huge benefit. I think that's going to be where we see the biggest shifts in quality and like performance as well. It still takes too long sometimes to generate those responses. It would be nice. And that, again, like performance always seems like a small thing, but if we think of like mobile or 5G, like as soon as you have better performance, there's like just different opportunities open up, whether where real time just is just required in some situations. So yeah, it will be exciting.
And Jeanette, 5 years, where do you see this going? Actually, just quickly, sorry, Jens, I have to say that you didn't want to make any big predictions, but the prediction that this is the, like, maybe we've capped out for a little while on Gen AI, like, I actually tend to agree, but I don't think you'll find a lot of people agreeing with that, because there's still definitely the view that it's going to exponentially accelerate over the next few years, and we're going to have robot overlords telling us what to do and think in the very near future. Somehow I highly doubt it. Jeanette,
and I hope they're wrong.
Yeah, I hope they're wrong. I mean, like, for all of us, they're wrong. Jeanette, 5 years into the future, how do you see AI evolving? How do you see that sort of integrating with the way that research is conducted? What's your take on this?
Yeah, so a couple of random thoughts. One is, we've really leaned heavy in this conversation and in my own practice into conversational AI. And we've not talked a lot about, text to code, text to fill in the blank, right? Text to images, and vice versa. I mean, like, I just heard about even smells, AI and smells, and so I think about when you start to build all the senses together and the ability as researchers to understand human emotion in a particular context, we'll have more inputs potentially that we could use. We also have more artifacts. Artifact isn't the right word. Stimuli is what I'm looking for, right? Like, not necessarily gonna, maybe we have the poop emoji and there comes a smell with it. I don't know. I'm kidding. See, I'm waiting. Like, this is how I know if people are paying attention. But in all seriousness, to be able to, thank you, spit out, much more easily. I'm not an engineer. I don't have an engineering background. How great would it be to, Jens and I have a conversation about what we think, how a design should change, and we can just, manifest that. I don't have to take a designer's time to create that. Or an engineer's time. And frankly, I'm just going to get on a rant here in a minute, but Figma has really cut us off at the knees as researchers in terms of our ability to research, because it really is pretty much a happy path. Anybody who used Acture, designers, low code could build fairly robust prototypes, and we as researchers could really test the effectiveness of those prototypes. And we can't do that anymore. But think about, with text to code, could we build those kinds of prototypes, much more easily without having that kind of engineering skill? I also think just the analysis side for me, whenever, I think we're going to get to this in a minute too, in terms of insights and roadmaps, but when we put together insights, one of the things that researchers often bristle at, and bristle may be strong, but we're concerned about, is that the insight, we work really, really hard to get something to this like very crisp sentence that says it all. But when you do that, and doing that, you've lost a lot of the nuance, you've lost a lot of the context, right? Like, I might know this to be true, and this is not unrelated to gut. I might know this to be true, but what are all the data points that connect up to this and that feed into this, so that if I say it to Jens as an insight, he can, like, really quickly, can you imagine, right, how AI could connect those dots for us and just pull all the various, even even interviews that that wasn't part of the discussion guide. I wasn't even thinking about that, but the customer just happened to mention this thing that is part of this insight, or it might be quant data or behavioral data. Like, I get really excited.
I mean, I'm getting excited. I'm furiously writing down these notes to pass on to our own product team. Obviously, we are at Dovetail working on some AI solutions that kind of touch on areas that you're talking about. But I think we'll have to get you in for we'll have to research the researcher sometime and ask you a few questions, because certainly some exciting ideas about how AI can kind of pull all this together. And that's what I want to touch on now, is this insight, a roadmap creation, and ensuring that our roadmaps that we're making are driven by real customer insights. We want to talk a little bit about gut feel. First question, I suppose, is like, product managers often find it hard to assess the validity and relevance of qualitative data. Perhaps this is just because it's harder to understand, like, whether it is like the sample sizes are usually smaller, though the data is richer. A lot of product managers, I think, feel very comfortable with quant. This just tends to be a trend across the tech world in general. We find safety in numbers. Like, what sort of tips do you have, Jeanette, for product managers who want to understand the validity and relevance of qualitative data? And how can product managers make better use of qualitative data provided to them?
Yeah, I mean, so first, it's about fundamentally making sure that we understand the difference between qualitative and quantitative data, and how that data is both derived and how it's used. So, we often misconceive qualitative data as the intention being that we're going to extrapolate to the broader population. And that's not the intent of qualitative data. It's intended to identify thematic trends, themes that we can, if we need to, right, we're an industry, so we don't, we might have enough strength in the qualitative data alone. We might feel that we need additional rigor, and we might triangulate with other data points. We might conduct a survey. We might look at behavioral data to strengthen our confidence in a particular insight that began with qualitative data. It may be the other way around, right? That you had quantitative data and you needed to get to that depth and that context and that nuance that you can't get just straight from numbers. So it's not, I think some of it is really understanding the difference between quantitative and qualitative data, making sure you're using them correctly. And then if you need additional rigor, then you should get the additional rigor. Like that's a motion that needs to be done. And that's why you have a researcher, right?
Yep. And a shout out to the framework again that you made, because I think that could be very useful for this problem as well. Jens, in terms of like qualitative data, product management, with a lot of qual data coming from all different sources, you might have support tickets, usability tests, you have researchers doing, in-depth user interviews. There's a lot of data, probably more data than there's ever been before, for a product manager to kind of sift through to try and understand. Yeah. Do you have any sort of tips for like prioritizing insights in a way that would help drive a roadmap?
I think like the first point in terms of trust, I think the trust is it like first-hand qualitative data that comes from a customer directly, somebody writing in, or is it somebody writing up an interview? And I think that's where I found, to plug a Dovetail here a little bit, just a write-up, you kind of disconnected from it. But if you then have the actual, like a transcript or the video of that person and you see them actually saying it, that makes all the difference. Right. So I think that's like, the more you can connect it directly to a customer or somebody, the more you can trust that data. I think the second part, like how do you use this? Like, I think, like, first of all, to give you a concrete example, we found in our data that people try out our product. It's about publishing release notes, but they don't press the publish button like in the first day. I was like, oh, why don't they try this out? So we have the quantitative data, but we're missing the why behind it, and that's why it's so important to then go back, interview people, and say, hey, like what happened there? Like, what's the anxiety? It's like, yeah, they're worried that it publishes somewhere, they don't know where it goes, they don't have it set up. So you get the insight. That's the only way you get those insights. And then you ask, like, how do you make sense of all that data? And I think this is where AI comes in again. Like, ideally, at the moment, it's honestly gut feel for product manager. And this, I think we're getting to that discussion as well. What gut feel really means is that you have all those different inputs from those different sources and the experience in the industry and just like a lot of build up, and then you can make a decision that just the brain connects those details. It's really hard to do this like manually.
Yeah,
I think
gut feel is something that we want to talk about a little bit. And I do like this idea that, like, I think a lot of researchers or people who are a little bit more rigorous and hard in their sort of scientific empirical route kind of cringe a little bit when they hear something like gut feel, because it sounds a little bit like magical thinking, you know, like, oh, I just kind of get a feeling about it, you know. But I think there's something to gut feel. And Jeanette, I know you do as well. Do you, like, I suppose my question is, where does gut feel come from? And if it is useful, how can we like what is it? And like, how can we like codify it or perhaps share it, or like, you know, like, yeah, take it away. What's your take on gut feel? Where does it come from? Is it useful?
Yeah, so my take on this is, and I'll be curious, Jens. I don't know that we've talked about this all that much, but so my take on it is that really gut feel comes from data and research. That you have that ability to make decisions more accurately and more quickly because you've built up this knowledge of your customer, of their jobs to be done, of the product. And so that's fundamentally what gut comes down to is, foundational knowledge of human behavior, add to that your customers, how people interact with technology, right? And the more you work in industry, the more like I can, designers, I'm sure amazing designers here who could look at a design and say, that's not going to work. And I can tell you why. I can predict for you what people are going to do. Is that gut? No. I mean, that's based on, yes, but it's based on the fact that they have observed so many users, so many customers over the years, and not just at this company that they're at today, but people just, human behavior and patterns exist. So I do think that we need to rely on that. And that's part of why I think, product managers, designers, engineers, we all need to be closer to the customer because we all need to build up that foundation to make better decisions faster. And we also need to know where the lines are, where we need to add rigor, where it's not enough to just rely on my gut. This is a big bet and we need to pause. And Jens has got, I could tell.
I'm just going to jump in really quickly because we are just about to run out of time, and we've got 2 minutes left. I just wanted to quickly share some things with our audience. Starting off with subscribe to our newsletter, the Outlier newsletter. If you want to stay in the loop for future events just like this, best way to do that is to subscribe. And we also want to do a little pitch, obviously, for Dovetail here. Dovetail is a great tool for product managers. So anybody who wants to get to know their customers better and wants a kind of easy to follow framework that can get you from your raw data to your insights, obviously can be as lean or as like rigorous as you want. That's the great thing about Dovetail. It's very flexible. And it's also a great way to codify actually what we were talking about here about gut feel. Great way to like get those instincts that you have as a product manager and actually put them out somewhere and codify them somewhat, and make them a little bit more official. And that way it's not just your perspective of the customer, but it's a perspective you can share. And it's something that you can kind of scale out that intuition to the rest of your team so that, and encourage everybody to share what they know. And over time, you'll actually build up a more cohesive and complete picture of your customer. And that's really one of the benefits of having all your insights and your data in one place. So I'm just going to share a little link here as well, so you can check out the product manager page, see some of the other benefits of that. Jens, Jeanette, thank you both very, very much. Jens, I think we are officially out of time now. Is there one more thing that you wanted to add?
No, I think that you summarized it pretty well. I think like ultimately everybody has gut feel. If you're just new to a role and you have gut feel, that's not a good thing. But if you have a lot of history and a lot of experience, and ideally you can point to documentation and other artifacts that back up your gut feel, that's really where it's valuable.
Okay, excellent.
Thank
you all. And a great session. Yes, I did see someone also mention that they weren't going to come today, but they did. Long day, comfy couch, cute dog, and gosh, Julia is so glad that she did come. So thank you, both of you. Thank you, everyone in the audience from everywhere you are in the world. Hope to see you all next time.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.